So far, we have written most of our code inside the default function. But why are we doing this? And how does K6 know about this function? In this lecture, we will discuss the structure of a K6 script and understand its lifecycle. And what do I mean by lifecycle? Well, when we're writing these scripts, the script actually goes through various stages. So for example, just to be more clear, in K6, there are 4 different stages. We have the init stage, we have the setup stage with this setup function here. We have the virtual user code stage, which is essentially this default function that we've been using all the time. And there's also a tear down stage, which is represented by this tear down function. So let's first begin with the init stage. What is the init stage? Now, first of all, you shouldn't confuse this with the setup stage. They're kind of like, you're thinking init and setup. Well, they're kind of like similar, but they're not the same. So what does the init stage do? And why doesn't it have a function? Well, the init stage, it's a bit more low level. So for example, what we're doing in the init stage, we are importing the different modules that we need. For example, if we want to do HTTP requests from our script, the script itself doesn't know how to do those HTTP requests, so we need to import this HTTP module. The same goes, for example, with sleep. If we want to add some pauses in our script, then we need to use the sleep function. And again, we need to import this because it's not automatically available in the script. Apart from this, the init stage also has this options variable. So this is where we define the different options. If this variable is not exported and doesn't have this exact name, K6 will not know about this and will not be able to use it. Apart from this, in the init stage, we may also load some files from the local file system. And essentially, any scripts that we write, for example, this console log statement here, you see it's not part of any function, which means it's automatically part of the init stage. So anything that is not inside the predefined K6 lifecycle function is part of the init stage. Now, this does not mean that we cannot define our own functions within the code, but we cannot use any of these predefined K6 functions. But anything that we do outside of these functions will be part of the init stage. Now, this code is typically executed once per virtual user, but it may happen that it is actually run multiple times, but this is something that we shouldn't really worry about. I just want to demonstrate how this works, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to comment everything that we have inside here. So I'm going to put here in a big comment. So let's go ahead and use K6 run, and we're going to use lifecycle as the script. So what do we have here? Well, first of all, we still have an error. So this is still a small mistake in the code itself. Let's go ahead and fix this. And then we're getting here a second error. It says here, could not initialize lifecycle.js, could not load JS text, no exported functions in the script. So essentially, the default function is always mandatory. So we need always to take this outside. We can't run this script without actually having this default function. So I'm going to move it inside here. This is where the virtual user code is being executed. I'm going to try once again. And what do we see here? We see a lot of comments being sent. Just going to stop it for a second, but you will see here from time to time init stage. So this is somewhere here. I just stopped the code here, but it's probably somewhere also in the beginning. So it's definitely clear that this init stage has been executed and everything else that is part of the init stage is there. Let's move on to the setup function. So what does the setup function do? First of all, if you want to use the setup function, we need to call it exactly setup, as you see right here. And apart from this, it needs to have the export keyword in front of it. Otherwise, K6 will not know about this. Apart from this, the name needs to be all in lowercase. If we write something else, K6 will not know about the function because it will be a different name and the function will not be called. For example, in the setup function, sometimes we may want to send some HTTP requests to maybe fetch some data, or for some, let's say, more advanced things, we can even use an API call to start an environment and then wait a bit until that environment is ready, and then continue with the rest of the code. So it's important to understand how this setup function works, because what we're doing essentially is that when we're doing something in the setup and we're waiting there, the rest of the tests will not start. So let me demonstrate you how this works. We're going to just use a sleep here so that you can see that there's nothing happening until we're done with the setup stage. So I'm going to go ahead here and use a sleep. And right here at the top of the script, we already have sleep imported. So I'm going to sleep for 10 seconds so that it's absolutely obvious. And previously, our virtual user stage, this also has generated a bit too many log statements. So we're going to use here a sleep of 1 second. Let's better understand how this works. And I'll run the exact same script once again. What we'll see here is that in its stage, this has been executed 3 times. We don't really care why. Now you'll see here we are in the setup stage, and we have waited there in the setup stage for 10 seconds until we have started with a virtual user stage. Super important. The setup function will only be called once per test execution. So it does not matter how many iterations we're doing. It doesn't matter how many virtual users we are having here. For example, I had here 2 virtual users. We can put it to 1. This has absolutely no impact on how many calls the setup function will be executed. There's one other thing that is important to know about the setup function. I said that from the setup function, we can actually make some HTTP requests, maybe fetch some data from somewhere. So what can we do with this data? Well, we typically want to pass it at least to the default function. So how can we do this? Well, the default function allows us to define a parameter here. So we can define here a parameter. I'm going to call it simply data. And once we're done here with the setup, so we're starting the setup stage. Let's say we're fetching some data. It takes a bit of time, but then we have the data. And I'm just going to go ahead and define a constant here. I'm going to define a constant called data. And this will be a simple object. So we're going to have a property with a name foo, and the value will be the string bar. Super simple. So what we can do here is actually return data. And you will see here, we're not calling default automatically or something like that. We're simply returning this. And K6 knows to take the value that we have here and to put it here as an argument to the default function. So let me show you how this works exactly. So again, with console log statements, trying to understand how these things work here inside K6. This is the best way to understand how things are going. I'm gonna run this once again. So what do we have here? The init stage. Then we are now in the setup stage, waiting for 10 seconds, fetching some data, doing some stuff. And then we have this data, and you will see here in the virtual user stage, we then have access to the data. So this is why we're getting this information here. It's being logged. Okay, and then I want to have too much information in the console. So I'm just going to remove this for a second, but just going to leave it there so that we can play around with it if we need to. With the default function, we're already a bit familiar. Strictly speaking, this is called the virtual user stage. It is called the virtual user stage because the code inside here is executed for every virtual user. What a lot of people are confused about is like, what if we have here one virtual user, but a test duration of 30 seconds or 1 minute or multiple minutes? And let's just assume that the execution of this script takes 1 second. What will that virtual user do after 1 second? It will just hang around? No, actually, if you're looking at the logs, what you will notice here is that once the virtual user is at the end of the script, so it's executing this, then it's sleeping for 1 second, and then it's done with this, and then it's starting the function once again. So essentially, it's never stopping. It starts again from the beginning. And as long as this execution that we have here for the script has not ended, it will continue doing this on and on. And this is what we call essentially an iteration, the execution of the default function, the virtual user stage. After we have executed all the tests and we have done everything, we also may need to clean up things. So for example, let's say in the beginning we have started a new environment, we have executed some tests, And now that environment is running there, but maybe we don't need it anymore. So we can use some API calls and essentially tear down that environment, but we need to know when to do that. So this is like one of the reasons why this teardown function is there. Again, it needs to have the export keyword in the beginning, and it needs to be written all in lowercase, exactly as you see here. This teardown function also has access to the data that we have from the setup. So for example, maybe we have some environment ID or some information that we have created during the setup, and we need to pass that information to teardown as well. So that information can also be passed here. So if we use a console log statement, we'll be able to see the information that we have returned from setup. Teardown is also executed only once per test execution at the end of the execution, and it has absolutely no importance how many virtual users you have, because it will be called only once. So we can take a look here, and if you let this run a bit more, we're gonna see here this teardown stage as well. So this is what we need to know in a nutshell about the different stages of a K6 script. Now, you may not need this immediately right now, but it's important to understand that they exist, in which order they're executed, and if we need to do something, you can do it in the right function.